I think this is a much wider problem than that, and that's a lack of oversight, or some may say adult supervision, over a set of units who really do seem to have some serious problems with their with what in other units might be called good order and military discipline.
Frank Ledwidge is a barrister and former military officer who served in Iraq, Afghanistan and the Balkans, and he joins us now. Hi, Frank.
Hey, Laura.
So can you just give us your reaction to this story, and particularly on this question of transparency? Do you think that there's more transparency that's needed when it comes to cases like this?
Well, if the MOD well-staffed public relations department, it's probably the only part of the MOD which is well-staffed at the moment. But if it had its way, would there be absolutely no transparency at all, and we'd know nothing except what they wanted us to know about special forces? But look, it's worth looking at this in a sort of wider context. Last week, 2 SAS soldiers were charged with drug dealing and implicit, or if not explicit involvement with organised crime. And of course, all this is against the background of the Haddon Cave inquiry, where this year we saw really credible allegations of cover-ups on the part of senior officers concerning murders, several dozen murders actually, in Afghanistan. As if that wasn't bad enough, the investigators for the Haddon Cave inquiry looking into this, who are really serious people, very competent, they're the sort of police investigatory equivalent of the SAS and the legal team as well, they, in looking into these cover-ups, they uncovered a system called Sonata. And in that, they found that officers had cached away, in order for military police to not to see them, what appear to be child porn as well. So this looks to me, and of course all these are allegations, not proved yet, but this looks to me like an organisation with a serious cultural problem.
And how do you improve on the transparency in cases like these? It's interesting reading my colleague Larissa's fantastic story in The Times that clearly it took repeated and persistent efforts from her to get the information on this. And even so, there is still quite a bit about this case that we don't know. What do we need to do to actually improve access to this information where it's in the public interest?
Well, public interest is the key question. If there are genuinely secret or sensitive elements about this, then so be it. But I seriously doubt that. It's no secret that the SAS were and are in Syria. They're also in Ukraine, probably many other combat zones as well. And they ultimately should and do, well, I say do, that's the ideal, answer to the rest of us. The problem is, of course, that as everyone who's ever been involved with the military knows, a different legal, or rather a different cultural or a different approach is always taken to these. These are the blue-eyed boys, and the law, generally speaking, doesn't apply to them. That needs to be changed. This is almost unique, by the way, in Western military forces. In the United States, there's a transparent legal system in relation to their special forces, which is regularly exercised. And as for Western Europe, these units are treated pretty much like any other. Caveat, of course, when they're involved in, or whether the crimes that they're concerned with directly involve national security, which in this case I don't think they do.
And is there any merit to the idea that revealing information this way could undermine the effectiveness of the military? That's one of the key claims that the MOD gave for why this information was initially withheld from the public eye.
No, I would suggest that's a specious, reflexive response.
And just take us through quickly, what kind of punishments are actually doled out for these crimes? If these men are actually successfully prosecuted, what happens next?
Well, they'll be prosecuted or currently under investigation of the Service Prosecution Authority. Now, there's been quite a bit over the last decade or so, a lot of complaints about them, but I think genuinely speaking, they do their best. And the last inspector's report, looking at their independent inspector's report, was quite positive about them. I've no doubt they'll do their best to act in a fair and appropriate manner. But as I say, they always face this problem with special forces, and indeed more widely. It's not just an SF matter of what one judge once called the green wall of silence, which is a closing of ranks like the mafia do. And there's the way to break that is to apply punishments not just for the crimes involved. And the answer to your direct question is, well, if they're convicted of murder, then the answer is the current sentence for murder is mandatory life. And that's how this should be dealt with. But look, what we need to look at a lot more closely, and which the Haddon Cave inquiry is, I think, and will probably continue to do so, is the question of cover-up and obstruction of justice. And that's what I want to see, or I would want to see here, as an instrument used far more often in these cases, ranging from, as I say, drug dealing to alleged child porn use.
And on the question of the Service Prosecuting Authority, which is basically the military equivalent of the CPS, do you think, you've cited other Western examples, which is really interesting, in cases where actually they have a much more similar procedure when it comes to justice as they would for civilians. Do you think that the actual nature of this should change? Do you think the Service Prosecuting Authority should be reformed?
A lot of my colleagues, former legal colleagues and human rights colleagues, would suggest they should. In this respect, look, they're faced with a much wider problem, which the Americans dealt with about 7 years ago by telling the special forces to get back in their box when they demanded special treatment, and they'd be treated like everyone else and subject, of course, to, in that case, congressional oversight. What we don't have here is parliamentary oversight of any kind whatsoever. Therefore, these people essentially write their own shit, as the saying goes. So the Service Prosecution Authority, I think, does a fairly good job with the rest of the service, although, as I say, there are concerns about their potential connections with the chain of command. But I think this is a much wider problem than that, and that's a lack of oversight, or some may say adult supervision, over a set of units who really do seem to have some serious problems with their with what in other units might be called good order and military discipline.
And is the inquiry you mentioned looking at that? Do we know so far what the scope of that is and what possible changes could come about when it concludes?
Well, the chairman of the inquiry, Lord Justice Haddon Cave, is an extremely capable and competent person with extensive experience of looking into the military. And he's the best possible person I think we could have looking at this. And he doesn't take prisoners, except in the most, I won't make any puns there, but we've seen with his quite proper treatment of Johnny Mercer, who refused to give details that he really should have given, and potential treatment, I think, of other officers involved with potential or, let's say, possible cover-ups. It's quite promising from that perspective. We may or may not see that inquiry report this year, but I think when it does, there are going to be serious changes, and the Ministry of Defence might be well advised to try and get ahead of that instead of trying to obstruct it. I won't go into any other issues concerning the inquiry, really, but because they're all anybody who's interested could go and look at the evidence given to them and the material that are put out. But I think one of the things that's pretty well known, that one of the problems they do face is perhaps a lack of cooperation from the units themselves. And indeed, it has to be said, the ministers involved with supposedly overseeing them over the last few years. I mean, if anybody watching the evidence of Ben Wallace, or for that matter, Johnny Mercer, will see what I mean.
It's really interesting. Thank you very much for joining us, Frank Ledwidge, barrister and former military officer. And you can read that story. 9 Special Forces troops could face war crimes prosecution at the top of the Times online.